Watch the video. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Can you all hear me over the air conditioner? Okay. All right. Carolyn and I are going to co-teach this class on Second Temple Judaism, or the world in which Jesus walked and talked. And as I'll point out in a moment, it's a world that has a particular story that people carried in their innermost being, very much like this prayer. A story that was inwardly digested. It was part of who they were. It wasn't the kind of thing that people had to give much thought to. It was like breathing. So what I want to do is explain why we're doing this class, and then say something about the story that we're going to try to cover between now and Advent. Obviously, Jesus stands out in the middle of history. Millions of people call him Lord and do their best to follow him. Countless others try to ignore him. Most of the world has adopted a dating system based on his birth. And the bottom line, of course, is that Jesus is unavoidable. But he's also mysterious, because what we know about him is very unlike what we know about almost anyone else. And because of that, we're forced to ask, just as people back then appeared to ask, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? Who in fact is he? But we are immediately, as we try to address those questions, we're immediately confronted with barriers. Two primary barriers are the barriers presented by his context, Jesus' context and his world, and the barriers that are presented by our context and our world. So, for example, in Jesus' context, first of all, you've got Jesus' world is strange and foreign to us. And what I mean by that is that people in his day thought differently than we do. I can't emphasize that enough. Very differently from the way we do. They looked at the world differently. They told different stories to explain who they were, what they were up to. And we do not habitually tell stories in the way that they did. So we got to try to get into that world if the sense that Jesus made then is going to make any sense now. Now, secondly, perhaps it may sound odd at first, Jesus as God is strange to us. Now, that may seem odd because isn't God just God? Well, no. I mean, from the strict technical Webster's definition of the word, that the word God is a word that we can apply generally across cultures and religions and time. But even a brief study of the major world religions will reveal that there are many different views of what God is like. So it isn't enough to ask if someone believes in God. The question is, what God are we talking about? And one of the reasons why Jesus puzzled the people of his own day was that while he was talking about God, very often what he said and did, did and did not make sense in relation to the God that people had in their minds back then. So we need to get inside that part of Jesus' world. And if that weren't difficult enough, now we've got the added theological dilemma, another context, again from his world, he spoke and acted as if he were in charge. He did things that were strange even then. He did things that people believed you were not allowed to do, and his explanation was, in a nutshell, he had the right to do them. He didn't act like a rabbi. He behaved as if he had the right to take over and to sort things out. So that's the barriers from his context. What about our context? Well, this is perhaps even more difficult. So bear with me. I think there are two assumptions that are kind of out there. Now, these are broad, sweeping assumptions that at one level might be unfair, but I'm trying to boil things down. Within conservative American Christianity, there is an assumption that is an assumption about the story that we follow called Jesus of Nazareth. It goes like this: a supernatural being called God has a supernatural Son whom he sends into our world so that he can rescue people out of this world by dying in their place. As a sign of his otherwise secret divinity, this Son does all kinds of impossible miracles, crowning them all by rising from the dead, returning to heaven where he waits to welcome his faithful followers after their deaths. In the Roman Catholic version of that story, you also have his closest friend Peter, founded the church, and anyone who wants to be with Jesus must hereafter join Peter's movement. And in the Protestant version, Jesus commissions his followers to write the New Testament, which reveals absolute truth about Jesus and how to get to heaven. And some of you are thinking, well, don't you believe this, Ben? Just bear with me and hear me out. Patience. And when I mean patience for the entire class from now until Advent. The second assumption comes from skeptical or progressive Christianity. Jesus was just an ordinary man, a good Jew, born in the usual way, remarkable preacher and teacher, but probably didn't do all those miracles. He certainly didn't think he would die for the sins of the world. He talked about God, not himself, and he certainly did not rise from the dead. If we want to find out about Jesus Christ, we have to work our way through the fog of the Gospels, sorting out what he really said and what he really did and what was put into his mouth by later Christians with an agenda and people who were probably on a power trip. We might even need to let some of the other Gospels speak, which were censored by those in power to squash competing views about Jesus. An underlying problem with both of these assumptions is that they pose their primary questions in the wrong place. I mean, for example, both sides want to come right out of the starting gate with, did it happen or did it not? Give me the facts, no metaphors, no interpretation. Did it happen, yes or no? Conservatives react quickly, yes, and that's that. The liberals say, no, of course not, and that's that. Or another question that both sides ask, was Jesus the Son of God or not? Well, again, there's a phrase that has to be unpacked. For a lot of people, Son of God carries all the assumptions of number one, the supernatural being, who swoops down to reveal secret truth, perform miracles, and prove his divinity, die a redemptive death, and go back to heaven, thereby blazing a trail so his faithful followers could get there too. So we're clouded, my point here is we're clouded by our own assumptions. And there's one final difficulty when trying to study Jesus, and that's the sheer historical complexity of trying to study him. The world of first century Judaism was complex in itself, just as much then as it is today in the Middle East. But we have 1,000 sources on which to draw for constructing a picture of today's problems, but for historians of the first century, we have a very difficult challenge. I mean, how many, could we even venture a guess, how many history books have been written about John F. Kennedy?
50, 100,
thousands, maybe? I don't know, a whole lot. When it comes to the historical evidence for Jesus, we have 4 written Gospels, written later by people who believed passionately that what Jesus had done and said, coupled with his death and resurrection, were of massive ongoing significance. But unlike today's historian, studying JFK, for example, in his historical context, we could pick up all kinds of books about the history of the 50s and 60s as source material for trying to figure out the world in which John F. Kennedy lived. But for us, we've got one book written by the Jewish historian Josephus 40 or 50 years later, after Jesus' death. We have a scattering of other materials, bits and pieces of tracts. We have coins, we have letters. And out of these disparate sources, we have to construct the setting in which Jesus said and did the things that he did. And in that way, we'll have an idea of how they could have made sense back then. Now, to boil it all down, this is what this class is about right here. If we don't make the effort to do this reconstruction, we will without a doubt assume that what Jesus did and said makes the sense it might have in some other contexts like our own. So this class is going to attempt to begin a process of reconstructing the context of Second Temple Judaism, the world in which Jesus lived. And there are other contexts we could go into, but we will probably only, like a skipping stone, skip on it and keep going, like the Roman world is a context that would be definitely worth exploring. We're going to try to reconstruct the big story of the Jews, which was the foundation upon which Second Temple Jews shared a common worldview. And this will not be easy to teach or to grasp because of everything I've just said, because of the barriers of the contexts in his world and our own barriers, our own assumptions and our own worldviews. Let me take, for example, a lot of people today are eager to know the answers to certain questions, such as, do heaven and hell exist? And if so, how do I get to the first and avoid the second? And then we automatically assume that Second Temple Jews were equally eager to ask those questions. I can assure you they were not. So our task is to allow people, your task is to allow people of other times and other places to be radically different from you. Now let me pause and say something, because in the process of biblical study, there is what we would call exegetical work, which is the work that we're doing now, is building a context in which the things of the first century would have made sense. But the exegetical work isn't the end of it. There's what's called hermeneutical work. That's the application. We're not doing application in this class. That doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as application. Of course there is. So what I'm trying to say to that is that if we start talking about things and you're like, well, wait a minute, what about the atonement? And things like that, well, whoa, you're getting ahead. Nothing that we're going to say is, at least in our mind, undoes anything about Christian theology and orthodoxy. But that's another step. That's the hermeneutical step. So, the big story. On your table is a handout, and on the flip side, I came up with the parts to this big story, and Carolyn is the one who thought eels and exile. Eels and exile. There are a lot of different ways that people, historians might try to break down the big story of the Jews. This was my way. Someone else might do it differently, But I think that this is a pretty good encapsulation of the story that people carried around with them. The story is comprised of these subplots called election, Exodus, land and temple, sin, and exile. When I say election, think of synonyms like calling, naming, choosing, and even creating. God creating a special people for himself. Election is the concept that a particular God chose a particular people to be his people. Out of all the peoples of the earth, God chose the Hebrews. He elected them. He called them. He named them. He created them, if you will. Another subplot is the Exodus. That's a big story. And within it are even other plots of rescue, of covenant, and law. Think of covenant as the establishment of a relationship, and law being the parameters of that relationship, a relationship with God. We've got land and temple, which is the concept that God promised to dwell. One of the Old Testament words for this is tabernacling, which literally means pitching tent. God pitches tent with his people, dwells with them in the land that he gave to them. It is literally the Holy Land because God dwells there. God lives there. Sin is all over this story. There is a certain chronology to this story, but there also isn't a chronology to it. You can't be too rigid with it because pieces of the story can go back and forth, but without a doubt, sin is present from beginning to the end. It's seen from different angles, and it's seen as both, on the one hand, a willful act, and on the other hand, a condition of the heart. There's something wrong with people. And then there's exile, geographic, spiritual, emotional, even political exile. And in that sense, the people of Jesus' day were living in a story that didn't have an ending. They're waiting for it to end. So there's this palpable expectation that God's going to do something. And Jesus then enters into that world. He says the things and does the things that he does. Now, I'm not going to attempt to try to shove every single book of the Bible into these categories that I've just laid out for you, but I'm going to give you the books of the Bible where you can find this stuff. I mean, for example, election. That's the book of Genesis. It is the calling of a particular people that begins with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Exodus, found in the book of the same name, the story of Moses. Land and temple is found in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Sin is everywhere. And then exile, you've got warnings and predictions from prophets Amos, Hosea, 1st Isaiah, which is the chapters 1 through 39, Jeremiah, Micah, Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk. You've got exilic prophets like Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah, which are chapters 40 through 66. And you've got post-exilic prophets, prophets who lived after people had returned from Babylon. Ezra, Obadiah, Malachi, Joel, and Daniel. Now you're probably familiar with some of these chapters, or maybe not. So I want to flush out a little, just like think of what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to election and go through that list and give you like a synopsis. Here's the synopsis of the story. Election is the chapter or the part of the story of how a particular God chose a particular people to be a special people, and He chose them for a particular purpose. And that last bit about the purpose gets lost and found in the life of God's people as they go through this story. But it is brought out first in Abraham, the story of Abraham, and it's brought out again in Jacob, the story of Jacob, where God says, I will bless all the peoples of the earth through you. We could even say that this is why God has created this special people. He's created them to reflect His good and gracious rule and love back out into the world. Exodus. You're probably familiar. Anyone ever seen the movie Cecil B. DeMille? It's old now, though. Okay, yeah. Our generation has seen it. Okay. That would look really good on a 70-inch screen. You're probably familiar with it. You have the story of Moses, the deliverance from Pharaoh in Egypt, the wandering in the wilderness, during which time God seals the deal of election with a covenant and the giving of law, summarized in the Ten Commandments. And one of the things that we carry around as Christians is how law has this negative connotation for us as Christians, because, of course, we don't live by law, we live by grace. But in that world, the giving of the Ten Commandments was seen as an incredible gift. It was a gift of God's love and graciousness. It was not perceived to be some heavy, big burden, but a gift from God Himself. Land and temple. Throughout the story up to this point, God has shown Himself to be present with His chosen people. That is to say, He's not far away, He's not far off, He's near, He's leading them, He's guiding them. He's there in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night in the wilderness, and He's leading them to a land that He will give to them. And He will dwell with them in this land. He will be their God, and they will be His people. And that you're my God, I'm your people, is intimately tied with the land that God is going to give them. And this part of the story gets very interesting and complicated with the development of the monarchy. But eventually, perhaps even as a result of the monarchy, a great symbol of God's presence is built eventually, a temple. And God will dwell in it. Sin, particularly Israel's sin, permeates the story sometimes in graphic detail. God's people are faithful, then they're unfaithful. They live into their purpose, then they live for their own purposes. And finally, the exile, the very thing the prophets warned would come to pass, comes to pass. Israel's sin leaves her in utter ruin. She's overrun by pagans and taken away to live in a pagan land to work for pagan rulers and masters. Now, let me try to tease this story out a little bit more. One of the big hot button issues, maybe not so much lately, but it's been a big hot button issue. You're driving down the street and you see someone has got in the back of their car a fish with the legs on it. Evolution. Okay? And other people are creation. And they both want to swing around Genesis chapters 1 through 3. And I think that Genesis 1 through 3 is way more interesting and exciting than reducing it to some book that is meant to literally describe 7 days even before the sun was created. It's actually far more interesting. In Genesis 1 through 3, you see eels and exile. Now, first of all, you've got Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is essentially a statement by God's people to the world. This is our God. This is who our God is. And our God is the creator of everything. And therefore He's before all things, above all things. He's sovereign over all. He's subject to no one. He is the one before whom all things will eventually bow, and to Him all things owe their allegiance. Therefore, their God is the one true God, who shows up all other gods for what they really are, pieces of gold or silver or wood or whatever, and nothing more. Chapters 2 and 3 tell in a unique narrative the story of God's chosen people and their relationship with Him. Now think about that story with me. Creation, election, the choosing of a special people. Now think about that. We all get hung up on, are Adam and Eve real people? Well, you're asking the wrong question. Who are the people who are the descendants of Adam and Eve in Genesis? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see how the story is the story of Israel from the very get-go. And it leads to further stories of election. God creates Adam and Eve. He creates them in His image to reflect back into creation His good and gracious rule. God will bless all the peoples of the earth, if you will, through Adam and Eve. Now there's Exodus, but there's the only segment of Exodus that's there is law. Remember I said that within that plot line of Exodus you've got rescue, covenant, and law. Clearly there's this unique relationship that God has with Adam and Eve. He is present in, literally, physically present there with them. But He does set a boundary. That tree over there, don't eat from it. The law. There's the theme of land and temple in it. We're told quite explicitly that God places Adam in the garden. And what's the thing about this garden? God walks in the garden. He's there. He's present. And that means that that's where He dwells. And that means that it's a temple. It's the land where God dwells. And Adam and Eve were created to be in that land. And then, of course, you've got sin. And sin is complicated from the very get-go. Is it a willful act of rebellion? Is there something else going on inside of them? What responsibility does the serpent have, and who the heck is he? Whatever sin is, the consequence for rebelling against God is quick and severe. It is exile. Election, Exodus, land and temple, sin, and exile. That's what Genesis 2 and 3 are about, in my humble opinion. It is not meant to be a story of creation so much as it is the story of Israel. And the people of God reading that story. And it would have been particularly meaningful to them during the exile to know that in spite of the fact that all had been lost, Their God was the creator God. Their God had created them to be in his presence. Their God does not forget them. This is who our God is. Now, a couple of New Testament teasers. In John's Gospel, chapter 1, and I'm just doing this off the top of my head, I'm not going to read you the story, but there's that bit with Nathanael. One of the disciples comes to Nathanael and says, "We've met the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth." And Nathanael says, "Can anything good come from Fitchburg? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" And then Jesus shows up and says to Nathanael, "Here's an Israelite in whom there is no guile." And Nathanael says, "How do you know me?" I'm not sure how to take that statement. Was that an arrogant statement on his part? Yeah, right, I don't have any guile. At any rate, Jesus said, "Well, I saw you when you were under the fig tree." And Nathanael responds, "Oh, you're the Son of God, the Messiah." And Jesus says, you're impressed by that? You're going to see a whole lot more impressive stuff. You're going to see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, what do you suppose he meant by that? Angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Well, we might conclude, given the cloud of our own assumptions, well, that must be some way of Jesus saying that he's God. But what's really going on is way more interesting than that. Because that image of angels ascending and descending actually comes from the story of Jacob, one of the patriarchs, the election. Jacob falls asleep and has a dream, and he happens to be in what will eventually be the Holy Land. He falls asleep and has a dream, and in his dream he sees heaven opened and a ladder descending and angels ascending and descending onto the land. And when Jacob wakes up, he says, "Surely this is Bethel, the house of the Lord. Surely the Lord God dwells here in this land." But he interestingly calls it a temple long before the temple is ever built. It is Bethel. That's what Jacob names the place, Bethel. So you've got this hearkening to land and temple. So now what is Jesus doing? It's way more interesting than saying, "I'm God," which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in a first century world. But in the first century world, it would have made sense, although it would have taken people aback, to be sure, for Jesus to say, "God is with me like he is in the temple." Whew. I mean, whew, those are big words. God dwells with me in a unique way. Angels are ascending and descending on the Son of Man, me. Or take the story of the prodigal son, which comes at the end of 3 stories. What is it? The lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. It's a great story. And Christians for 2,000 years have unpacked that story again and again and again, and I enjoy preaching on it. The story is really not about the Son at all. It's about God. God is really at the center of the story. Carolyn told me that one of her professors said, if you want to know who the primary character is in any of the parables, look at how it starts. The parable of the lost son begins this way. There was a father who had 2 sons. Father. That's who the story's about. The story's about God. And now think about eels in exile, particularly exile. The son, rebellious, willful, goes to his father and does the unthinkable, demanding his inheritance. The father, for his part, does the unthinkable, gives it to him. And the son goes off to a foreign land and squanders it and ends up having to work for pagan masters and rulers. And then finally comes to his senses and returns to find that, well, there is a father who welcomes him, does the most unseemly things for a first century father to do, like running to greet his son. But then there's the other son who's like, hey, I was here the whole time. I was obedient to you. I did everything you asked me to do. What's that story about? Well, it's the story of the exile. Of a people who wantonly rebel against their God, and as a result are sent off to a foreign land to work for pagans and pagan masters and rulers. They're eventually allowed to come back, only to find that there are other Jews who never left. And there's been a battle between the two of them ever since. Those other Jews referred to as Samaritans. There, remember the story with the Samaritan woman at the well, and the woman asks, you know, where should we worship God, on this mountain or that mountain? Of course, the Samaritans were like, hey, we know where the right place to worship God is. We were here. We never left. You guys left and forgot all about Him. It's a subtle retelling. It's not only a subtle retelling, Jesus is retelling the Exodus in a subversive way. I mean, the exile in a subversive way. Showing God to be a gracious and loving God in spite of massive, insulting, unthinkable behavior on the part of the Son. It's way more interesting. And once you understand the eels in the exile and are able to keep that story in the back of your mind, a great deal of the Gospels will begin to make sense. You'll begin to see, particularly in the Gospel of John, how Jesus is going around. You know, John does have Jesus say, I am, a lot. I am is what? The name of God, Yahweh. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. So John has Jesus saying this. John's already made it clear in the beginning of his gospel that what we're about to read has everything to do with the very beginning of the story. But from there, you've got Jesus taking over the great symbols of Judaism. I've already alluded to one, the temple. Later, he basically puts himself in place of Torah, where he talks about, I'm the bread of life. Well, the Torah was the bread of life. Jesus replaces all of the feasts with himself. It's like all of the sacred cows of Judaism are replaced with Jesus. And when you know the story, you know the backdrop, you'll see it. Now, I got to do one more thing. And I just want to go over this glossary with you quickly. As we go along, Carolyn and I will be throwing out words that we've tried to identify some of them in advance. Because when I say, for example, the Hebrews, there's only a certain period of time when God's people are known as the Hebrews. And it's the time of the Exodus into the Promised Land. So Carolyn, when she's talking about the Exodus, may refer to the Hebrews, but then she'll stop referring to the Hebrews. Here's the most difficult one, and that's the word Israel. Because on the one hand, I can use the word Israel to mean the entire Jewish race, the entire people, throughout all time and place in history. It's also known, it's the land, the Holy Land as it's known today. But the Israelites are the Hebrews once they've entered the Promised Land and up to the divided monarchy. You don't want to know, what's the divided monarchy? Well, initially there was one kingdom, but then later there were two. And while there were one kingdom, they were the Israelites, because there was just Israel. But then when the kingdom divided, Israel became the northern kingdom from 922 to 722 BC. The Jews are God's chosen. The name of the Hebrews have gone from Hebrew to Israelites to Jews. That is, the people from the time of the exile to today. Judah is the southern kingdom from roughly 922 to 596 BC. By the way, Jew comes from Judah. When the exile ended, Israel never, they are the lost tribes. Carolyn might refer to the lost tribes of Israel. There is no more Israel in the sense of the northern kingdom. It's gone forever. There's only Judah. When we get to prophets, Carolyn reminded me, I don't know to what extent this is a problem, but it might be. A lot of people think a prophet is someone who tells the future. That's not a prophet. A prophet is a spokesperson for God. You know, thus saith the Lord, and what follows is prophecy. It might entail something of the future, it might not. What defines the prophet is not whether it tells the future, it's simply, thus saith the Lord. I'm now speaking for God. Anything I need to add? No?
You said the Samaritans and Jews,
The Samaritans are Jews who interbred and intermingled in the interim from the exile. After the exile,
they're Israelites then. The Jews and the Samaritans are never the same, right?
they're a mixed breed.
But I thought the Samaritans were from the other kingdom, from the other tribes.
The Samaritans were the Jews who did not leave.
Right.
There were two deportations from Judah. The first one was in 596, and the second one was in 587, 86. In the first one, most of the elite were not deported. In the second one, the elite were deported. But in both cases, there were still Jews who were in Judah, even after the Babylonians had conquered and taken over the land. The Jews who remained started to marry Babylonians and members of the other tribes that go way, way back. And when the Jews returned after the exile, here were these people who had been part of the kingdom of Judah, who are now intermarried with Babylonians and Hittites and, you know, God only knows what, and were not considered to be true Jews because they had stayed behind. They weren't the only ones, but the Samaritans very much absorbed the culture of the Babylonians, and that is why Samaritans were, at the time of Jesus, were put down by those who tried to uphold the Jewish faith as they understood it.
Could you clarify the difference about where to worship? Because my understanding is the Samaritans never believed that Jerusalem was that the temple in Jerusalem was the place to worship God instead of the mountain.
That would apply to Jews from the northern kingdom who came back. And what I'm getting at is the northern kingdom had no Jerusalem. Jerusalem was in the southern kingdom.
Right, and you were saying that so you're saying that Jews the word Jew came from Judah, the southern kingdom.
Right.
So that's where my confusion was, and understanding that the Samaritans belong to the northern kingdom, and that their place of worship had not changed from the first.
As I understand it, the term Samaritan got applied to those who stayed behind and intermarried, which therefore meant that they were not true Jews. They had spoiled the line, for lack of a better phrase, and therefore were despised for doing what they needed to do to survive when everybody else.
And they despise the returning Jews from exile as usurpers.
Right.
So come along lately types who come in and act as if, hey, this is our place. What do you mean it's your place? We've been here all this time. So there was a great deal of hatred between the two. So when I say Samaritans are Jews, I'm simply trying to point out that they have that Jewish ancestry.
They are descendants of the Hebrew people, of the Israelites, of the United Kingdom, of the Jews of the Southern Kingdom, the Judeans of the Southern Kingdom, etc.
So if you did their lineage, you find that going back, at some point, all of their relatives were Jewish. At some point.
You could trace them back to the Hebrew people.
Okay.
If they had Ancestry.com in those days.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
In regards to the Hebrews breaking up, and I just want to know where the Torah fits in. Is it
Where the what?
Torah? I never studied the Torah at all. Never read it about it. But is it specifically the Old Testament that we have?
The Torah is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the Torah.
So is that all stuff written by Moses?
Well, tradition says that it's written by Moses. Carolyn and I would maintain that it's not. And as far as Torah, the stories that are contained in those 5 books were lived as oral stories for centuries. Now, before you conclude that means that they aren't that trustworthy, in a world where there really wasn't much writing and everyone told stories verbally, those stories remained very much intact from one generation to another. Now, my understanding is that, so these stories have all different kinds of theories about where they've come from. The exile is the crisis that causes them to be brought together and put into a book. Now, it might have been a little bit before that. My historian just left the room. But I mean, when you're talking about David, for example, David didn't have the Torah. I mean, he had something. He might have had the law. He might have had big bulks of it. Some of it was probably written down, but it had not all been compiled and put into what we now call Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then you've got the prophets. Of course, David, I think David did write many of the Psalms, so he didn't have the Psalms as we know them. He was busy writing them, some of them. it's really kind of fascinating stuff, because now there are theories about, say, Genesis, for example, just to take that as one example. There are theories about these oral traditions that were out there and then eventually came together. And one theory is called J, E, D, and P. The Yahwist, Elohim, the Deuteronomic, and the priestly source. E for Elohim is one of the names for God, and there are sections of Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, where Elohim suddenly appears all the time as a name for God. But then other times it's Yahweh. And so a theory is that there was someone or some thread of the story got hooked on Elohim. Then you've got, well, I skipped over J. J is Yahweh, although it's not spelled with a J. And you've got the Deuteronomic historian. The Deuteronomic historian, one excellent example, of course, is Deuteronomy itself, but also the book of Judges. One of the things about the Deuteronomic historian is that the Deuteronomic historian looks at history in terms of a cycle. And when you read the book of Judges, it pretty much goes like this. There was, the God's people were all happy and everyone loved each other and was having a good time, and then the Jewish people rebelled and they did something stupid, and then they got in trouble, and then they cried out to God, God help us, and God sends a judge, not a judge as we understand it, but a rescuer to come and help them. The rescuer rescues, everything's back to normal, and the whole cycle starts all over again. Like Samson, the most well-known story. Genesis, I would say J, E, D, and P, the priestly source, is like Leviticus. All the stuff having to do with the job of being a priest. Again, they're theories. All right, Carolyn's going to pick up next week. And our hope is that we're going to get through all the way to the exile by the time of Advent, so that when we start, we'll really be in a position of anticipation of God sending a Messiah. That's what we hope to do, is build up that anticipation, and then we're going to be waiting for the coming of Israel's Messiah. All right, see you next week.